Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I am on with Madhavi Nevader. 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 Ne-
Madhavi Nevader.
there you go. Yeah, I had it really good, and then I don't know what happened there. The pressure got to me. Either way. Okay, so Dr. Nevader has a wonderful article that she wrote on the topic of Ezekiel and Genesis, talking about comments of creation, Ezekiel 28, like the cherubim that many people debate about. Is that Satan, Adam, or what's going on there? There's also passages in Ezekiel of Pharaoh being called like the sea monster, stuff like that. So what that really odd stuff. We're going to talk about all that today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Okay. So you wrote a specific article on this topic, and that's linked in the description. I don't know if I'm pronouncing even this right. Creating a Deus non creator, divine sovereignty, and creation in Ezekiel. Could you talk about just your summary of what you argued for in that paper?
Yeah, absolutely. So if I could just give a little bit of a background, we meet annually as Bible geeks in the Society of Biblical Literature, and there's a
Hmm.
group that's specifically devoted to kind of theological readings of the Book of Ezekiel. Because of all the major prophets, he's definitely the black sheep of the group. None of the Christmas, prophecies from Second Isaiah and Isaiah, and he's much grumpier than Jeremiah. So he's had a bad rap, and so this group has really spent the last 40 years trying to understand this book.
Hmm.
And so we spent a year having a number of sessions, invited sessions, looking at the God of the book.
Hmm.
And that has turned into the book that this article's in, called The God That Ezekiel Creates. And at the time, I was teaching a class on creation in the Bible,
Hmm.
where I noticed how little Ezekiel came up in the discussion and text
Hmm.
that people read in this class.
Yeah.
Um, but also, I was working, as I still work, on as kind of concepts of political sovereignty and monarchy in Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel 28 is a text that I spend a lot of time with.
Hmm.
And so I started to wonder, with this conference in mind, is the God of Ezekiel a creator God? Like he is in Isaiah and like
Yeah.
he is in Jeremiah, these kind of great poems extolling God as a creator. And I concluded that he wasn't. And so I kind of had this question, what can I possibly be right about that? And so the article is really me working that question out. Okay. And so I look firstly at some of the kind of texts that people have associated with creation traditions in
Hmm.
Ezekiel. And I, both in terms of what texts they are or not talking to or about, look at some of the other arguments from great scholars like John Kutzko and Stefan Pass about kind of larger arguments about a kind of latent creation tradition in Ezekiel. And I make the rather bold claim that, I mean, I don't say outright that I'm right, but given the question I led with, I do actually think that there is a conscious decision in the book of Ezekiel not to um, play or depend on any number of the creation traditions that we about Yahweh
Huh.
that we know were circling around at the time.
Wow.
And so it's a question of my mind, and we can talk more about this in our time together, is like, why would our author do that? What
Hmm.
is the importance of that silence? And so back to this question of, um, the God that Ezekiel creates. Well, I'm making the argument that our prophet is choosing not to present God as a creator, and that this is a purposeful kind of theological decision that's being
Hmm.
made, not simply happenstance or he just forgot one day. And so I want to kind of understand why that's the case.
Interesting. That's really, really cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So you noted a number of different times where scholars have argued that, hey, the writer of Ezekiel is quoting or referencing Genesis 1 to 4. Of course,
Yeah.
Genesis 1, that's the creation text, and then you have Genesis 2, you have the creation of Adam and Eve, and then
Mhm.
or the man and the woman. Then Genesis 3, you have this idea of, like, the what people consider the fall and
Mm.
the curses, and then the talking of the serpent to the woman. What
Yeah.
all that stuff's going on there. So I guess we shouldn't say chapter 4, but 1 to 3 is typically what people talk
Yeah.
about with Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Could you just go over just a quick little survey
Yeah.
of different things people argue for that they
Yeah.
think Ezekiel is referencing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, let me say that, there are some clear overlaps, so it's not like everybody just made something up and I came in on a big white horse. I was like, oh, I'm right. So there are some very interesting kind of uh, what some see as parallels, so from Genesis 1,
Hmm.
as you said, the kind of the big 7-day creation text,
Yeah.
we have the verb bara, to create, that appears both in Genesis 1 and Ezekiel. We have the word tehom, which is the abyss, the tanin, which is a sea creature. There's languages of kind of be fruitful and multiply in both
Hmm.
texts. And there also seems to be some use of the divine image. Remember in Genesis 1:26, amongst others, it says, let us make humanity, Adam B'Tselmeno, in our image.
Hmm.
And there seems to be some kind of play on that as well in Ezekiel. But also more specifically with Genesis 2 and 3, the kind of the Eden texts. Um, Eden appears in both texts, and there is a guy.
Yeah.
There's a guy in Eden, or in the garden in Eden.
Hmm.
There's some gemstones. There's a cosmic tree. Obviously, in Genesis 2 and 3, it's the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Ezekiel, it's just a really big tree. There are some swords, and there are these cherubim, or a single cherub in Ezekiel. So there do seem to be some kind of parallel vocabulary, lexemes,
Yeah.
and locutions, for sure.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and you have a nice little chart about that in your paper, so people can
Yeah,
check out that out in the description. So yeah, what we found really was interesting to me, Ezekiel 29 and 30,
yeah,
they talk about Pharaoh, a great sea monster,
yeah,
which people might find that a little odd, like in today, like why would you portray the Pharaoh as
yeah,
a monster?
yeah.
Um, or maybe that is a little bit obvious for some people, but
Mhm.
I wanted to just throw up the passages on the screen here real quick.
Yeah,
So like in the 10th year, in the 10th month, of the 12th day of the month, the Lord came to me, mortal, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, prophesy. And then it says, the I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon sprawling. My Nile is my own. I made it for myself. I will put hooks in your jaws. And so he's like talking about it like an animal. So like all kinds of odd imagery there. What do you think's going on there?
yeah,
And
yeah.
um, why is that relevant to the discussion?
Yeah. So these passages are just so wonderful. And they're part of a kind of a larger chunk of text in Ezekiel called the Oracles Against the Nations.
Hmm.
It's a kind of type of prophetic oracle that you find in the major prophets, Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Isaiah, as well as some other ones. But what's really interesting about Ezekiel is that they're all kind of collected into one distinct unit. And in particular, a number of them are pointed specifically against kings,
Hmm.
about the king of Tyre. There's definitely a big stab at Assyria. And here, the kind of epitome of human rule of Egypt's Pharaoh is really taken to task. And to call him a sea monster is like a a 3-leveled insult. I mean, first of all, it's just insulting, right? I mean, at the most basic level, it's a good old-fashioned put down. It's you just calling him a nasty thing.
Hmm.
Um, but where it gets really interesting is just kind of the nature of the insult itself. So he's not just calling him a big fish. The Tanin, or along with Leviathan, who you and many of your listeners will know about from things like Psalm 74. It was associated with kind of primal, almost primeval chaos, okay, as a sort of animal manifestation of cosmic disorder. Okay, and think a little bit of the Hydra, which some people will know from the Greek tradition, or even the seven-headed beast that will, come back in Revelation 13. And so, it's not just calling him, a big old messy fish. He's calling him, an agent of disorder.
Hmm.
And then beyond that, or maybe it's even a 4-level insult. The third thing is that it's in addressing this specifically to Pharaoh, who, according to Egyptian theology, which will have been known throughout the wider Near East, was the kind of single individual on earth who was thought to maintain cosmic order. And so when Yahweh says something like, so he's kind of saying something like, you think you are the epitome and guarantor of cosmic order and justice, but in fact, you are cosmic disorder. And comparing him to this wild, disorderly animal. And then the 4th level, so it is indeed disorderly. Not only is it that, but it's an animal where we have a very widely attested tradition of being involved in some sort of primordial battle. So in the literature, until very recently, it was called the Chaos Kampf tradition. The Kampf, battle with chaos. Of course, the Germans invented it, with some nod to Greek. So and now people more correctly refer to it as the combat myth, because it's not always chaos involved. But it talks about this kind of a battle that takes place between two different types of gods for sovereignty. And kind of universal cosmic sovereignty. And we know it from the Bible. Again, it's in Psalm 74, it's in Psalm 89. It's probably the tradition behind the Exodus itself, or at least the way it's praised. It's kind of builds into this trope. And of course, we know it from Mesopotamia. It's the foundation of the Numa Elish story, and also from the Levantine Baal cycle, where always there is this younger deity who fights another watery agent for supreme power. And so in calling Pharaoh this watery agent, everybody knows who's going to win. And it's definitely Yahweh. It's definitely God. And so it's kind of this really masterful poem about insulting Pharaoh's belief in his own value, and also showing that his defeat is inevitable.
Really interesting. Okay. And so that's all really great stuff. And that does bring us back to the original reason why you mentioned the paper. So what does that all that have relevance to the creation idea?
Yeah. So I think it's because of this combat myth aspect, which is that because in the Numa Elish, Marduk battles Tiamat. These are two Babylonian gods. Again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating what people don't know, or repeating what people do know, or speaking about things that they don't. But basically, the Marduk, who's the main god of Babylon, defeats this kind of first generation or second generation deity called Tiamat, and after fighting her, he then creates the world. And so what used to happen is that people used to associate the combat myth with creation, that the two always went hand in hand. as it does in Babylon. I mean, and
Yep.
remarkably so. It's a masterful poem. But it doesn't have to, and that's where the version from Ugarit, or ancient Levant, a kind of old Canaanite polity, with the Baal myth, he doesn't create the world. He just fights his enemy and becomes king.
Mhm.
And so, in bringing that up in the article, I'm sorry, I did slightly take a rabbit hole there. I think it's possible for Yahweh to be claiming that he will defeat Pharaoh without necessarily saying that in doing so he's a creator God. Do you
Hmm.
see?
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of asking my readers just to kind of keep these traditions apart, not least because we know that they aren't bound to one another, even though they are in Mesopotamia and they are in some of our biblical texts as well.
Hmm. So what you're saying is Ezekiel was referencing this combat myth, but he wasn't specifically claiming that any creation was involved in this. So we shouldn't be making this claim like, hey, Ezekiel's portraying this creation just because he's mentioning the myth, right?
That's exactly right. I mean,
Okay.
I think. Thank you. I mean, I think what it's showing is that Yahweh wants to say to Pharaoh, "I am going to be victorious over you," and
Yeah.
it has nothing to do with creation, at least in this context.
Yeah. Right. Okay. And then we have a really interesting passage that probably most people, if they're familiar with Ezekiel, they'll be familiar with this one, Ezekiel 28.
Yeah.
So this is often used to, it's about a cherubim. Maybe you can give us a little summary of what happens there. I'll put it on the screen. But people
Yeah.
think it's Satan, Adam, or what. Could you just give us a general
Yeah.
summary of this passage here?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ezekiel 28 is really, again, another wonderful text. Again, in this collection of oracles against foreign nations, and
Hmm.
again, um, eh, discussed or addressed to a foreign monarch. Okay, so the chapter is divided into two poems. The first one is against the prince of Tyre, and the second one is against the king of Tyre.
Hmm.
Okay. And in both of them, whether they're one and the same is a scholarly debate, but the accusation seems to be very similar, namely that that the figure was kind of created as a superhuman figure, beautiful, wise, perfect in complexion, right? Yeah, perfect in beauty. And in the second one that we're talking about, it's described as being in this garden surrounded by jewels. But then this figure comes to trust in his beauty and becomes hubristic. And for that hubris is not just expelled from the garden,
Hmm.
but is sent to the underworld, is killed and shamed in the most horrible ways in front of the nations.
Hmm.
Um, and so we have a poem here that shares a number of different features with Genesis 2 and 3, but importantly, we have an individual in a garden who, because he comes to trust in his own qualities, is then
Hmm.
expelled out of the garden.
Hmm. Okay, really interesting. Okay. So you argued in your paper that this is not this trying to portray the same story as
Yeah,
Genesis 1, or I guess Genesis 3 in this case.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
could you talk about maybe quickly why you think that? I mean, there's just so many parallels
yeah,
to what's to the two stories. Like for example, um, yeah, I mean, although bara is used, and it is in Genesis 1, not necessarily Genesis, I guess the second creation narrative,
yeah,
but it is still that similar term there.
yeah,
There is mentions of gemstones. There's
yeah,
mention of some type of creature, like kind of like a cherubim, but um, there's also a number of different things. Maybe you could talk about those, but like
absolutely.
what about it makes you think, okay, this is maybe not talking about the Genesis narrative?
Yeah. Okay. So, that is a totally fair question, and again, I'm slightly arguing against the grain with this. Um, For this reason,
Mhm.
I suppose on some level, we also have to admit that Genesis 3 isn't a creation text. It's an expulsion text,
Mhm.
right? It's about Adam and Eve
Mhm.
who chose to disobey, and in doing so, lost um, their ability to remain in the garden.
Mhm.
So, be this as it may, it's nonetheless now part of a bigger creation tradition. So, let me also preface this by saying, until 20, 30 years ago, nobody would have asked this question. It
Really?
simply would have been assumed that Genesis 3 and 2 and 3 kind of predate Ezekiel 28, but there have been a whole bunch of kind of movements and kind of shifts in the scholarly world, which is um, starting to kind of ask, when were these texts put together? And one thing we have to sort of remember when we're reading Bible is
Mhm.
that if something happens early in the narrative, it doesn't mean it was written earlier. And Genesis 1 to 3 does so much theological work for the Bible as a
Okay.
whole,
Mhm.
that it might be that the decision to tell that story that way um, might have been a decision made after the composition of Ezekiel 28.
Hmm.
Okay. So and that's one of the debates. It's something that we are talking about, with real interest in kind of what that means for understanding these various texts.
Mhm.
Okay. But the point I make in the article is that you're absolutely right. There is all sorts of language that overlaps. But a lot of the language in the poem,
Mhm.
specifically the beauty of the king, his wisdom, wealth, the kind of quasi-divine status,
Mhm.
gardens, gardens are associated with human kingship in the ancient world, Israel included. Um,
Mhm.
and there's even a Neo-Babylonian text that's a text from Babylon from the middle of the first millennium that talks about the creation of the king, that has as many, if not more, overlaps with Ezekiel 28
Ah.
than Ezekiel 28 has with Genesis 3.
Hmm.
And on top of that, we have a huge tradition or garden temple tradition, where gardens are considered to be the homes of gods.
Mhm.
And they're on mountains, they have gems, they have rivers, they have guardian beasts like cherubs, these kind of hybrid beasts. And so my point with this, a little bit like the chaos comp tradition, is to
Mhm.
say that Genesis 2 and 3 and even Genesis 1 put this information together in order to tell the story one way. Um, and Ezekiel also uses that information, but my suspicion is that we have a kind of a larger, what we might call garden mountain tradition
Mhm.
from which both of them could be pulling,
Mhm.
rather than necessarily saying that they are dependent on one or the other.
Hmm.
Okay. And so, I don't know if you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh or any of your listeners have. It's such a beautiful poem, and
Hmm.
it talks about the cedar mountain as the garden of the gods, and speaks of the fact that it's kind of bejeweled. And so clearly, the one way that you talk about where gods live is you put them in some place really green, especially if you live in the desert, with a whole bunch of jewels.
Hmm.
And I think you can see that in Genesis 3, and I think and 2, obviously, more 2, and you can see that in Ezekiel 28. What's harder to show necessarily
Hmm.
is, or rather, there are other ways to explain why these 2 texts have shared vocabulary rather
Yeah.
than the fact that they're dependent upon one another.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. That's okay. Keep going.
No, no, and so, and again, it's a kind of question of what kind of worlds do you wanna open up, and I think it's what I'm suggesting, at least, is that I think Ezekiel 28 and Genesis 3 are using royal traditions, not creation traditions, royal traditions to actually topple human monarchs or the concept of monarchy at all. Now, that's taking us well beyond this article and well, kind of beyond our time together. But I think Ezekiel 28 is doing that explicitly by expelling a figure who's royal in name and certainly in personality. And this is part of a much bigger kind of monomaniacal argument against kingship in the book. And I think Genesis 3 is doing something similar. Adam is very royal. And to expel him is a profoundly important theological move.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So that's the question, at least on those kind of shared aspects, is I think, you can say they are similar because they're sharing the language, or you can say actually there is a just as well attested tradition outside that they could both kind of be pulling on, and we have that well enough attested that it at least seems plausible. And then to your question of created, I mean, that's also a really important one. This is bringing us back to kind of Genesis 1, because it says to the character in the second poem, you were created on the day that you were created, and it uses this particular verb bara. And again, I don't know how familiar your listeners are with the finite grammar of Hebrew, but what's important is that a bara as a verb always has a divine subject. And so unlike other creation verbs like to make or to form or to build, which can have both a human subject and a divine subject, bara cannot. There only a God can bara. And so again, point to Genesis 1. But what's interesting about Ezekiel 28 is that in both instances it's passive. It's addressed to the king or this royal figure, and it says you are created. Yahweh doesn't claim that, right? He never says on the day I created you. So if you look at 13 right at the end, on the day that you were created, they were prepared. And then again in 15, from the day that you were created until iniquity was found in you. Okay. And it's interesting. I mean, not only is Yahweh very happy to claim activity in this poem, I placed you in the garden, I cast you to the ground, right? And more importantly, in Ezekiel, it has the highest concentration of verbs where God is the subject in the first person in the entire Hebrew Bible. This is a book about I, as Yahweh, am doing everything. And so it's a funny little passage that he isn't claiming to have created this figure. And so he's been created, and probably by a god, but of all the fights Yahweh wants to pick in this book, and believe me, he wants to fight a lot, this is not one of them. Okay. And so again, at the very least, I think we can say Yahweh doesn't want to claim this guy or claim credit for having created him.
Just for some clarity, so basically you're saying Ezekiel is essentially not saying, hey, Yahweh created this cherub figure or whatever. Specifically staying out of that subject, not claiming who created it specifically. It might have been Yahweh, might not have been, but just not claiming it specifically for a reason. And that's kind of what we're going to dive into. That's really, really interesting. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but because this is probably worth the whole discussion. But was there anything maybe contradictory of the passages of Ezekiel 28 and Genesis 3 that you're like, okay, yeah, these don't seem to be the same, describing the same thing?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are a couple different things. I mean, first of all, there's one person in Ezekiel 28, and there are two people in Ezekiel 3. I mean, let's not forget poor Eve. So again, we're talking about a different number of protagonists. This guy definitely dies. Okay. In Ezekiel 28, Adam and Eve will die, and of course, that's a real debate about Genesis
Right.
3. But the point about this is that he dies in the poem. And also there are some kind of extraordinary references to kind of contaminating sanctuaries in the poem in Ezekiel 28, which just doesn't make sense of Adam. Some people read Eden as a temple, but this speaks very much about cultic misdemeanors. And in fact, there are some in the German world that read this poem about a second century high priest. It kind of goes into the Hasmonean debate that you will know from Maccabees, and indeed Daniel. I don't, but that's why they go there. And so, what we have here, I think, are two expulsion traditions. And that do similarly damaging theological work.
Interesting. Of course, you have the language of like, in the abundance of your trade, you were filled with violence. It's like obviously Adam or Eve or the cherubim in Genesis 3 were never talked about of trade or I threw you to the ground and placed you before kings that they might see you. Like, what that doesn't make any sense in the Adam context.
No. That's right. I mean, this is definitely happening in real time, and seems to have Tyre in mind as well. I mean, Tyre was known as a mighty sea trade power. I think an older poem has been reused here to specifically talk about Tyre. And again, I mean, I think it's still possible to have an expulsion tradition. I mean, I actually think Ezekiel's invented it, but hey ho. It's still possible to have an expulsion tradition without it being a creation tradition. That's probably really my point in this particular article.
Right.
That this gives us a garden, it gives us a god, and it gives us a slightly superhuman human who gets chucked out, and none of that in principle has to be tethered to a creation tradition, because we have it everywhere else in the ancient Near East, and it never is associated with creation. So that's kind of what I'm getting at.
Yeah. So something I wanted to say to my audience is, okay, so maybe like, this specific presentation, the arguments that Dr. Nevader has given to us say they are, for whatever reason, not convincing. What I do want to enunciate is that it makes us really think about the interesting points of like, hey, just because there are similar aspects of a story doesn't necessarily mean that they could be talking about the same idea. So you mentioned the other Babylonian king texts, like that has maybe more similarity. So just like, okay, just because it has similar ideas doesn't mean it's actually talking about that. And what I would say is like, hey, just keep that as possible, at least. Like, it be possible. There's no reason to claim certainty on this topic at all, but keep things as at least possible and talk about that. But
Zach, that's exactly right. And also, I mean, I mean, let me just reiterate that all scholarly work is basically an informed guess. We're trying to make sense of the text in front of us, and we are all students of and readers and lovers of Bible. I mean, it's what we spend our time doing. And it's impossible to do anything other than say, maybe we should read it a different way, and this is maybe this is a different way of doing it, knowing very, very well. And this is what the history of interpretation has showed us, that whether we think we're doing it or not, we always bring ourselves to reading of the Bible, and also we have to remember that the Bible is really smart. I mean, it's really smart. And so, another passage that I haven't talked about is later in Ezekiel 31. There's a moment where it talks about, being fruitful and multiplying, which is probably what will be in your Bibles. It's talking about the restoration of the land, and it says that once again, the land will be fruitful and will multiply. Yeah, it's 36. Forgive me, it's not 31. It's
Okay.
36. 36:11. Forgive me. Now, going back to my bigger thesis, this is a big text. Like, surely this is a creation tradition, right? And what's so interesting about it is that it's actually missing in the Greek tradition, or the Greek version of the Book of Ezekiel, which we know from manuscript evidence is a little bit shorter than the Hebrew version. And a few chapters are in different order. The book that's really the craziest on this front is Jeremiah, which has 8 more chapters in Hebrew than it does in Greek. But what's interesting about this passage in Ezekiel 36:11, and I will multiply humans and animals upon you, and they will increase and be fruitful. Okay, actually, that's a really good translation. So first of all, it's here's one of my cats. So first of all, it's missing in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Bible, which is pretty early. Secondly, it's the other way around. Okay, and they will multiply, v'rabu, uparu, and be fruitful. Okay. And then also, it's not a command, right? It's talking about what's going to happen. It's not a command to humanity. It's talking about what the future holds. And so what the fact that it's missing the Septuagint and the fact that it's slightly out of order shows us is that somebody chose to connect our two texts and inserted something in order to make that connection explicit. And you can see why, because if you look around, it's such a great, kind of number of verses. It's talking about God promising to kind of do right by the land. He's going to increase Adam u'behema, man and animal. Animal or beast. Behema is the word that's used in Genesis 1. I mean, to be fair, also in Genesis 2. And it, this kind of promise to make it big again and fruitful, and he will restore it to what it once was, and he will make good. He's promising, I'm going to make good on these promises, basically. And so you can see how somebody thought, wait a minute here, we have good, though in a different form. We have Adam and we have beast. Why not add something in here so that the two passages align, so that the command in Genesis 1 to be fruitful and multiply also appears here? And what that shows us about the Bible is, firstly, that there is kind of really intentional, well thought out intertextual linking that's going on between books that later scribes have put in, so that as a listener, most likely, or a reader, that you're supposed to now read the text together. Okay. Now, what I'm doing is I'm going a step back and I'm saying, I think people did want us to have Genesis 1 in mind here, but I also want us to understand Ezekiel before we read it through a creation lens.
Mm.
Right? Because I think it's more interesting. No, that's not fair. I was going to say because I think it's more interesting. It's not that I think it's more interesting. It's just I think by reading Ezekiel through Genesis 1 to 3, we lose how powerful Ezekiel is. And I want to understand Ezekiel first, and then I'll read it with Genesis 1 to 3.
Yeah.
Where it becomes a bigger story.
Hmm.
And so to all of your listeners who I assume are all readers as well, you can read your texts on their own, but you have to start reading your text with the text that they are then talking to themselves. And one of the principles of intertextuality is once that link exists, you always are reading them together. And so as much as I have argued for reading Ezekiel without Genesis 1 to 3, it's really hard to do it now. Because they're just always in dialogue. Okay. In the same way, in the same way, think about the prologue to John, in principio. That's in Latin, and arche, hein ho logos, right? There is no way to read John without Genesis 1 now, or indeed Proverbs 8, and the three texts will forever be interlinked. And that's how that works now. So, there's a lot of very interesting work to be done in intertextuality. It's not my world; it's my colleagues' world. A number of my colleagues in St. Andrews work on it because they were educated at Wisconsin and then a New Testament at Duke, and were trained by Hayes. So it's a real world there.
Interesting.
But my takeaway for everybody here is don't assume the Bible's stupid. As a brilliantly crafted text. And even the reverence that we have for Bible, there's still sometimes a tendency to think that it's not very well put together, and holy moly, is it?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. So let's see here. Maybe kind of let's get into a little bit of the detail here. So you talked about 36:11, talks about fruitful multiplying. That same verse talks about doing goodness, which is similar to the idea of the creation being good in Genesis 1. So like that's a lot of intertextual links, it seems like. So is your position that Ezekiel 36 is not actually referencing Genesis, or it's just not specifically referring to creation?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I don't think it's referring to Genesis 1. I mean, I think that it's. I mean, okay. Ezekiel comes from what we broadly consider to be the priestly school. There are a lot of shared vocabulary with a lot of the priestly texts from the Pentateuch, Genesis 1. If you can divide the flood story, good luck. You win the prize. But bits of the flood story, and obviously things that you get in Leviticus and Numbers, and indeed the end of Exodus. And so, wherever this book came from, it came from that world. And so there is without doubt a shared vocabulary. But I think the fact that a Hebrew scribe, after the Septuagint, after the Greek translation, chose to gloss Ezekiel 36:11 so that it explicitly referred to Genesis 1, shows that, it seems like they're using the language of a worldview rather than the language of a text. Okay. That goodness, especially, goodness as a verb, is not particularly rare. It's just, to cause something to be good is to cause something to be good. And later, or again earlier, this is 31. There's a reference to home. This and this is the same word that's used in Genesis 1:2, that the kind of the wind of God was hovering over the Pnei Tachom, the face of the deep. And again, is this a reference back to Genesis 1? Well, it's hard to say, because Tachom is like talking about the south. I mean, it's a geographical term, albeit a cosmic one. Yeah, thanks, guys. So here, the waters nourished it, the deep Tachom made it grow tall. So we're talking about this cosmic tree. And in fact, that's a great text, because it shows you precisely what Tachom is. In Genesis 1, it's just kind of like this watery nothingness. But it refers to, something that appears a lot in Hebrew Bible. It appears over 35 times. And it's just a very specific part of the cosmological structure of the universe. And so we have Sheol, which refers to the underworld, where people go when they they die and go to sleep. There's no concept of, well, there's certainly no concept of hell yet, and there really isn't a concept of resurrection yet either. But Tehom is this kind of subterranean, watery abyss, and I think it's that's what they're both using, because they're both describing cosmic geography rather than trying to link the two texts.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So those are another couple examples where, at the very least, you could say it's possible that Genesis isn't being referenced. Simply mentioning similar vocabulary doesn't mean it's specifically referring to it. And you mentioned too that like they seem to be written by Ezekiel, and then Genesis 1 seem to be written by people that use a lot of the same language.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that, of course, they'd be using the same language, even though they might not be referring to each other.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you've had John Walton on the show a couple times, and his illustrious career has been spent kind of talking about the world outside the Bible. And over the last 10 years, he's done this hidden X. Excuse me. And as more and more texts from the ancient Near East are translated and we become familiar with them, we just know that a lot of these ideas were just floating around, and so and that there are kind of traditions behind the Bible even. And it's not like somebody just sat down one day and said, okay, now we're going to write Genesis. It's all of it, and Ezekiel as well. It's pulling on these kind of rich mythological traditions that we know. I mean, heck, it was just published a couple weeks ago. They found a little stamp seal, which is something that people used to kind of stamp in ink or wax or clay, of a hero fighting a 7-headed dragon, and they found it in Israel, which is just so important because it's one of our kind of first big material cultural evidence for this tradition being around. So we know that it was there.
Yeah, that's cool. I'll have to pull up a picture in just a second.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll send you the link.
Cool. So let's see here. Yeah, all right. So this kind of gets to like the crux of the argument there, like I don't even know if I'm using the word right. The main point of all this leads up to. So you argue that creation's kind of unimportant, absent from the text. Like you briefly mentioned it. Is there anything else you want to add? Like, why is that significant? Is that unexpected? What's the takeaway there?
Yeah. So I definitely want to argue that it's absent rather than unimportant.
Okay.
And I think its absence is profoundly important. And so I'm trying to suggest that the book is intentionally and purposely not appealing to creation traditions in its kind of bigger argument, kind of an apologia, if you will, for the sovereignty of God. And in not appealing to creation, the book is really surprising. Okay? Because creation is such a big part of how Jeremiah, and then that kind of really important middle section of Isaiah, which we call Second Isaiah, Isaiah 40 to 66, kind of deal with the kind of theological trauma and questions that are raised by the exile. And the exile was absolutely disastrous. Because it destroyed kind of all the foundations of traditional theology. Temple, land, king. And there was a basic assumption that any victory or defeat on earth was a reflection of the power of one's God. Right? You know, and I don't, next time you've got your Bibles open, like go read Psalm 44, where we have this kind of extraordinary minority report about people, you know, Israel, or the communal voice, saying, like, we didn't do anything wrong. Like, where are you? Are you asleep? You know, have you forgotten us? You know, this kind of desperate plea for divine help. Now, Jeremiah and Second Isaiah answer that question. Like, is the exile a reflection on the impotency of God, you know, his inability to act, by saying, no, look at creation. So what's so interesting about Ezekiel is that he doesn't do that, even though the whole book, to the point of almost kind of theological uncomfortableness, is a defense of God being in the right. You know, he does everything so that you will know that I am God. And this is why people don't read Ezekiel to feel fluffy. Nobody feels fluffy after reading Ezekiel. It's painful to read. And so the question then kind of becomes, you know, why doesn't he use creation? Everybody else does. It would be so easy just to do so, you know. And what I kind of offer, and this is just me offering, right? Nobody tells, the book doesn't tell you why, you know. And so at this point, it becomes me giving you my educated guess. You know, we know in the book that there are a lot of issues between God and the land. That the land as invaded, the land is left empty, the land has done violence on it. It's kind of an argument against, is seen as an argument against the power of Yahweh in Ezekiel. And so one thing I offer is that if that is the case for just, you know, the exiled land, how much more so land as created by Yahweh? You know, how can a God let that happen? How can he let his creation get so out of hand? Okay. The other thing I suggest is, and this takes us squarely back to Babylon. The pretext of the book is that Ezekiel himself is in Babylon. And we know in the Babylonian exile that, you know, large communities were in and around Babylon. And this is where the Enuma Elish becomes so important, because the Enuma Elish is the story of how Marduk, the patron god of the empire that just burned Jerusalem down and took all of its population away, or yeah, there we go. A lot of its population away. We're going to come back to it. It's so fabulous. Managed to, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So thinking about seven-headed dragons, but you know, the you know, one of the great combat myth traditions and poems, one of the greatest pieces of literature, celebrates Marduk as creator. And my suspicion is that Ezekiel chooses not to use Ezekiel. Ezekiel chooses not to use Ezekiel. That's the stupidest sentence in the world. My suspicion is that Ezekiel chooses not to refer to God as creator, so that it doesn't turn on, it doesn't kind of make live the Marduk tradition. Okay. And oddly, in that sense, we lose Yahweh, the creator, in Ezekiel, but we gain Yahweh, the sovereign and sole God of the universe. And so it's a question of at what cost. And for Ezekiel, he was willing to lose creation for the larger cause of sovereignty.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. Are there any other scholars that have argued any other possible explanations for this?
Yeah, you know what? People don't care.
Oh, okay.
Largely because people don't really care about Ezekiel. Though I should say, I mean, this group that is responsible of this volume, we're all very, very dear friends, and one person in particular, he and I basically think the opposite on pretty much every every possible tradition, and so that it's always it's always lovely to see him and share our thoughts with one another. So it goes back. It's kind of a tricky story, and again, it's a question of how much time you want to think about it. But Ezekiel is associated with the kind of rise of nascent Judaism. And I don't know if you or your listeners will know about somebody named Julius Wellhausen, but he basically made the comment. I mean, he created modern biblical studies, but he made the value judgment that the priestly source led to Judaism and became a religion of law and killed religion. And the prophets, who were much more based on kind of ethical monotheism and religion of the spirit, is what would inform Christianity. And in fact, historically, I think it was really a Protestant Catholic debate, but it ended up being a Christian versus Jewish debate. And so Ezekiel has always kind of been considered as the prophet who kills prophecy. And in that sense, nobody really cares what he does. Not least also because, as I said, he's just so difficult to read. Can't take that difficulty away. I mean, the text is horribly violent at times. The last temple vision that I do a lot of work in is mind-numbingly boring. I mean, if you can't sleep, just read some of the measurements. But it is just a masterful text. And as I said at the beginning, I think one of my commitments to it is just to kind of highlight that brilliance, which may mean it is outside of the usual perspective, but I think it does a number of extraordinary things in its very much in its own way. And so I just wanted to highlight some of that in this work.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. So just for clarity for my audience, so
Yeah.
you don't literally think that people don't like Ezekiel or don't care, but for the most part, you're saying that like it's not focused on a lot.
Yeah, no, that's right. Thanks for, I was being slightly flippant. I mean, I think it has historically been a text that people haven't been as interested in. Isaiah is called the fifth gospel, and other prophetic texts are more interesting, and it has just historically been labeled as kind of boring and prosaic. Even though, we have the Valley of Dry Bones, which of course has a long, very interesting
Right.
reception history, and, the new heart and new soul. It shares with Jeremiah, but usually Jeremiah gets credit for it. But it's just historically, Ezekiel hasn't been as amenable
Huh.
to kind of theological reconfiguration.
Yeah.
Remember, it's a little bit like Lamentations. I mean, it is set in exile and it's bleak. Even the restoration is, you will be restored so that you know how bad you are. And some people just don't like that. They kind of like oh, you'll be restored and everything's going to be okay. And, there'll be pink unicorns.
Yeah, right. Well, that's really interesting to hear. I have not heard that before. I also haven't done a lot of study in Ezekiel,
Yeah.
but that's just really interesting because I think Ezekiel is one of the coolest texts.
Yes.
For example, of what we're talking about today.
Absolutely.
All the different references to Babylonian tradition and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so back to that picture, just referencing it quickly. So you have a serpent with 7 heads that was found in Tel Hatzor in Israel.
And so you can see that there's some cherubim there, you see? Down there with those winged hybrid things, which is very cool. And this figure is fighting the serpent. It's really interesting. The other thing that's very interesting about it is it has some Egyptian life signs on it. Can you see that? What this shows us is just how many different traditions Israel was engaged in at this time. We have Levantine traditions here, we have Mesopotamian traditions here, we have Egyptian traditions here, all on an Israelite seal. And it means it must mean, and there's a winged beetle, also Egyptian. Oh, it's just so fabulous. And also a winged snake, if you see up there, which is also Egyptian. That's what seraphim from Isaiah 6. The seraphim. I always think of what's that movie with Whoopi Goldberg?
I have no idea.
Yeah, that's okay. It's about nuns, singing nuns. Anyway, the seraphim in Isaiah 6. That's exactly what they're talking about. They're winged serpents, and so there's just this kind of wonderful kind of medley conglomeration of Near Eastern. I mean, it's almost a soup of mythological traditions in this seal.
Yeah, it's really cool. Beautiful. So you're talking about Sister Act, right?
Yeah, Sister Act.
I did a quick little search. I'm not that good with the references.
Thanks. Yeah. Lots of seraphims in there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay. All right. So we're almost wrapping up here. So looks like we got all those questions actually. Was there any other things that maybe you argued in your paper that was worth mentioning there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think the main take is, I think the main take is for your listeners and for everybody is twofold. One, biblical books weren't written in the order that they now appear. And that there is definitely a story that is told, and oh, what a story it is. The greatest story ever written. But that sometimes you have to go deeper into the text to find the older stuff. A really good example of that would be the Psalms. In the Psalms, we have some of ancient Israel's oldest poems. And it takes a long time to get to the Psalms. And also just to say that, because we tend to read Genesis 1 first, we just always have creation in our mind. And I think that's intentional on the part of our compilers. But, with our texts, in Ezekiel, there are actually a lot of other mythological traditions that he's pulling on. And that chart that's just come up, this is me just, kind of saying, here is the crossover. And that there are ways of explaining that crossover that don't mean that the two texts are dependent on one another.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and even if now we will always read Ezekiel with Genesis 1-3 in mind, I sometimes it's exciting to try to take a step back and let Ezekiel just be revolutionary on its own.
Awesome. Okay. Quick question on that, actually.
Yeah.
So there was a few references that we haven't mentioned here.
Sure.
So there's like the breath of light,
Yeah.
life. So the Genesis 2:7, the breath of life is put into Adam.
Yeah.
Genesis 37:8. I don't know the exact context there.
That's the Valley of Dry Bones.
Okay, Valley of Dry. Okay, so it
Yeah.
says, and in your chart it says use of different terminology.
Yeah, I mean, it's just not the same thing. It's not the Nefesh Chaya. It's just different things, And I mean, how are you going to revivify some bones? I mean, okay, so there are a number of different traditions of how you create life. You have the Potter traditions, you have the kind of mixing traditions, you have the image traditions, which we'll come to in a second. But it's talking about bringing dead bones back to life. Is that an act of bringing life out? Absolutely. Does that bring us back to Genesis 2? I don't think so.
Right. So just similar ideas don't necessarily mean it's a reference.
Exactly.
Another one is the Paradisal River. So 47, 1-12. This is talking about the temple.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have the river in Genesis. But, of course, the river also branches out. So, in other words, a lot of people have said, hey, Ezekiel mentions a river with a temple. And this is a reference to Genesis. So, what do you think about all that?
Yeah, it's just, again, I mean, you go back to those divine garden traditions, and that they all have rivers. The idea of a temple is that it's kind of supposed to be on the axis mundi, where the point of where the beautiful waters from underneath, the life-giving waters, come up. And so you don't need Eden for that. You can go back to old-fashioned, like, Sumerian temple theology to get a river in Ezekiel 48 or 47, forgive me. Does Eden have a river? Of course it does. It can't be a garden without a river. Even fake gardens, they put rivers in them. They put artificial rivers in them. Which is very cool. That's for a different discussion.
That is really cool. And then you also mentioned the sword. That's a perfect example. Genesis 3:24, it talks about, I think it's the cherubim that have the sword that's protecting the garden or whatever. And then 13-22 of Ezekiel talk about a sword, but it has nothing to do with Genesis. It's literally just a sword.
It's a sword,
right? And then the cherubim. That's when we kind of talk about that. Then there's the divine image of Genesis 1:26 that humanity is created in, with Ezekiel 1:26-28. So that's an interesting parallel there with the verses, right?
I haven't yet figured out if that's meaningful, but yeah.
But yeah, so what is that? Just talking about like gods or idols?
Yeah, so it's that really difficult bit in the beginning of Ezekiel where it's trying to describe, God. Which is why in early rabbinic tradition you had to be over 35 before you could read it. You had to be an adult man before you were able to read it, because it's the closest description we have to God in any text. But the whole point is that it's about God. It's not about humans. So that's not a connection. They're just using the language of likeness.
Interesting. Okay, cool. And there, not to take too much of your time, but there's one other thing that I find really helpful for this discussion. Like, you talked about like these references that seem similar, but you're like, hey, that doesn't seem like it's a firm enough correlation there to say like, hey, these are the same references, referring to the same stories. So in your eyes, like, what kind of things should people look for if they are to conclude that it is referring to something like the Adam and Eve story? So I would assume maybe something like a phrase like, do not eat from the tree, or you'll surely die, or something like that.
Yeah, that's right. So, again, I mean, if something like the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the only other place it shows up is in Genesis 2 and 3, so that, that, sorry, there is a lot of work that's been done on this. And, what I would say is that when you want to try to figure out if texts are talking to one another, usually the best principle is that there has to be more than one connection. Okay. So, if it's a really rare word, like it only appears twice in Hebrew Bible, but if it's not, then you need some other categories, and whether it's kind of in that same phrase, or if there's a structural parallel. And so, I would, he's he's now kind of changed his mind on all of the categories, but if I could refer listeners to the first chapter of my colleague's PhD dissertation, which is now a book. It's William Tooman's Gog and Magog. And he talks about, I'm trying to get him and my other colleague who both studied together to write a book on this so that everybody can know. But it's about, what are you looking for when you're trying to establish dependence between texts?
Yeah.
What are the categories? Because it can't just be like light, or one word if it's a super common word. I do a lot of work in Deuteronomy on the law of the king, and the word for horse appears in there, and the word Solomon is known for horses. And so everybody says, oh, this is referring to Solomon. I mean, a horse is a horse is a horse, and it's like saying both texts have the word car in them. So I think there are definitely some principles, but and so if you kind of Google or have a look for anything on just kind of principles of intertextuality, and what works for Hebrew Bible doesn't quite work for New Testament, but they're kind of part of a similar thing, because there's and there are different types of things. There's direct quotation, there's allusion. Sometimes our authors want you to pick it up without being explicit about it. In a way that, I said, gosh, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times. I'm obviously riffing on, on Dickens, but I'm not saying, and now I am going to quote Dickens, so that, so there are all sorts of different possibilities. And then also there's pastiche, which is when, people write in the style of something else, which is also very cool. Where they're intentionally making it sound like something else.
Interesting. Yeah. So all that's really interesting, because even if you had an explicit sentence like "you will surely die," like there are other times in the Bible, I'm pretty sure, and just in people in general, people say, yeah, you're going to surely die, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, and one one of the things we have to decide is, how many ways are there to say that you're really going to die in Hebrew? And there's only one way. It's mot tamut. That's how you say it. In the same way I say to my 4-year-old son, like, you really need to get out of the bath, or like, you really need to go to bed. I mean, there are only so many ways I can say that. And the Bible was written by people who spoke a language, and we have to be careful, because we're looking at a very, very specific iteration of that language, the rules of which we don't know. We've had to reconstruct, and we're looking at a very, very small sample, albeit a great sample, and so you're absolutely right. I mean, temple is temple, horse is horse. You will surely die as you will surely die. you know, and and some people also make a lot, again, in a different context. It says to Adam, you know, you will keep and you will tend to the garden, you know,
Oh.
so it's shamar and avad. You know, well, to keep, I mean, it means 9 million different things, and it's all over the Bible. And the same thing with avad, you know, and so it could be doing work there, but you need other things in order to
Yeah.
say that it's doing a particular type of work.
Yeah, and just for clarity, Genesis 2 talks about Avad and Shamar, work and
Yeah.
keep for Adam. People say, oh, yeah, that's Adam's a priest. But technically, those words are used all over the places.
Yeah.
They can mean other things. So,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a lot to make on there. But no, it's just really interesting. Like you could have an entire quote of something and still not be referencing that thing. It's just really fascinating. This discussion in general. But anyways, that's a lot to say there. It's been so much fun having you on. Was there any
Absolutely.
work other than the paper that maybe people should check out? Maybe not even on this topic, other things you've written on that you want people to see?
Oh, sure. So, I mean, again, it depends on how much time you have. I mean, how much of a glutton for punishment you are. I mean, another article where I actually talk about Ezekiel 28 specifically. There's a nice little volume that a friend of mine edited, and you can see my literary geek out. It's called Yhwh Against the Kings of Middle Earth,
Ooh.
and that's specifically about that oracle series we were talking about. And it talks about the Pharaoh passage. It talks about
Mm.
Ezekiel 28 and some other passages. You know, and a lot of my work has recently been on kind of the politics of some of these texts. So I've had an article in the Oxford Handbook on Ezekiel. If you guys suddenly get the Ezekiel bug, go look that out. It's a great volume. It came out last year, and it's online as well, where I just talk about the kind of the bigger. I said earlier that there's this kind of push against monarchy in the Book of
Mm.
Ezekiel, and I speak about that a little bit.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. Um,
absolutely.
yeah, so there was a number of comments or questions in the chat, but unless if you have just all the time in the world, then we can answer those later in the comments or
Absolutely.
something like that. Okay.
For
All right.
sure.
But yeah, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been fun. We'll definitely have to do this again. And
Absolutely.
otherwise, I hope you have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.